Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our National Climate League broadcast. I'm Natalie Richards, your NCL Commissioner. The NCL is an initiative of the Climate Reality Project Canada, a chapter of the larger International Climate Reality Organization. We'd like to take this opportunity to remind you that across the upcoming 2020 year, there will be 5 new climate reality leadership trainings offered across North America. And if you're interested in attending one of those trainings, we invite you to go to climatereality.ca for more information on how you can attend to equip yourself as a change maker in your field and get connected with other climate activists. I will briefly introduce the 2019 NCL results. We had a very successful last season. Over the course of 2019, we doubled the size of the NCL Stat Tracker, which covers 30 sustainability indicators. This season, 82 municipalities across the country participated by submitting data, and that means that 53% of Canadians now live in a municipality that has data in the Stat Tracker. So that is super exciting. In addition to a brief overview of the 15 secondary indicators, the 2019 standings also features examples of best practices across Canada and across the world. The image that you see here on the screen illustrates participating cities where there is an established climate reality hub. And you will see that awards for top performance in the areas of our sustainability indicators span the country. This season, the City of Halifax took 4 awards home for air quality, tree canopy cover, landfill waste, and local agriculture. And other 2019 winners included North Vancouver, Victoria, Vancouver, Calgary, Kingston, Ottawa, and Montreal. You can find more details on the winning cities and best practices in the full standings document, which we invite you to download for free from ncl.climatehub.ca. And to remind you that the launch webinar for the standings, in addition to all future webinars, including this one, can be viewed at hubflix.climatehub.ca. I'll take this opportunity now to introduce our guest speaker today. We're very excited to welcome Michael Wexler, who will be discussing with us cyclable cities and how we can create safer, healthier, and more sustainable cities. And a quick reminder that you can engage with us by asking any questions at any time throughout Michael's talk using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So Michael is a Montrealer and urban designer at Copenhagenize Design Company, a boutique global consultancy based in Copenhagen, working to legitimize the bicycle as an important tool in our urban transport toolbox. Copenhagenize is known for their pioneering philosophies about simplifying urban planning and urban cycling, and how cities and towns should be designed with anthropology and sociology, not just engineering. As the head of the North American office in Montreal, Michael works with cities and governments around the world, coaching them towards becoming more bicycle friendly. He has a diverse background in urban planning, project management, design, and visual media, and a master's of planning from McGill University. So thanks so much for joining us today, Michael. We'll pass the podium your way now.
Thanks very much. And I will share my screen if you guys can let me know if you see what I'm seeing. Great. So thanks for having me today. This is actually my first webinar, so it's a different way of talking, but I'm excited to discuss with you today the bicycle and all of its wonderful ways that it can improve our cities and our lives and our planet. So second here. So who are we? Another sort of brief little description. Copenhagenize Design Co. We've got 3 offices around the world. Like was mentioned, we are a small consulting firm that works out of Copenhagen, Brussels, and here in Montreal in Canada. And we work in sort of 3 different prongs. So not just a planning firm that does planning and urban design, but we also really feel it's important, if we're going to actually create normalization of the bicycle in our cities for transport, that we do it through communications as well as research and education. So what that kind of looks like is as much reach as we can have all over the world. So from projects here in Canada doing neighborhood strategies for the new University of Montreal campus, cycling plan, to doing behavioral campaigns in Copenhagen and designing school programs in Sao Paulo. We're trying to sort of approach this from all different prongs to have as much positive benefit as we possibly can for cycling around the world. So some of that work looks like the urban planning and design that we would be doing in a recent client in Shymkent, Kazakhstan, the third city of Kazakhstan, not the place you would expect to see a lot of cycling, but they do have a mayor on board that really wants to change the transport paradigm. So how can we help them create sort of a vision for the future where all ages and abilities, somebody can go with their children, or somebody at an older age can take their bicycle to the store or to school and still be protected the whole way. Equally, projects more in North America, working with the private development sector, a private firm in North Carolina to do a neighborhood development plan that integrates cycling at the core. So not just adding in some painted bike lanes or some bike parking as a little throw in afterwards, but how do you actually think about developing a community, developing retail hubs and living hubs that integrate the bicycle infrastructure as a core tenant. And then here at home in Canada, working with the city of Saskatoon to actually create a campaign, communications campaign that really talks about the bicycle differently. So how do we try to change some of those conversations that are very negative about the bicycle that we hear across the world about the fact that people will never ride, or, you know, bicycling is just for a certain type of person, and trying to break down some of those stereotypes by showing that the bike can be for everyone. So this is all based in a philosophy that we really think that our cities were bicycle friendly. It's not just that it's some modern hipster millennial thing that we're working on today, but we have photographic evidence of our cities all around the world that were bicycle friendly when the bicycle was used as a mode of transportation. We have map evidence. We know that Motor City America, Detroit, the roads were legitimately paved for the bicycle. The early models of car prototypes by Henry Ford were actually made from bicycle parts. Here in Montreal, we have a bicycle map evidence going back to 1897. So this is not something new, and we keep forgetting that. So one thing that we try to do at Copenhagenize is on the communications and the education front is to create little memes that can maybe move that conversation forwards, and to try to look at the 7,000 years of settlement building across the world and the history of traffic engineering. We can see in these graphics on the left that the 1800s, the 1900s, transportation was very A to B, direct network connections for things where you were walking on your own two legs, taking a horse, then maybe starting to take a bicycle, and early forms of public transportation. And from 1950 till now, until the auto industry really came onto the scene, the networks have completely flipped. So the only direct network connections we even have in our cities, for the most part, are A to B direct connections for cars. In our street network, we have these loop-de-loops for public transport, as you see on the right here, and then these completely fragmented, broken networks, if they could even be called that, for bicycles and pedestrians. So we think this is completely backwards, because we have this evidence, we have this example of when our streets were used for more democratic fashions beyond just transporting cars. But when the car came in and the rise of the automobile and the industry and this utopian vision of what the future could be, suddenly everything started changing. And words that we think have been around forever, like jaywalking or things like crossing zebras and crosswalks, these were things that were actually created by the auto lobby to try to make sure that they could herald people, you know, walkers, cyclists, and put them, you know, to the side so that the car could really have efficiency and penalize anybody that wasn't moving around with that concept. So we really feel like we need to take that question that's been asked for so many decades at this point, especially in North America here, of saying how many cars can we move down the street? And instead of using that as a measure of success, we need to change that question and say, how many people can we move down the street? And we actually know with a different orientation where we include public transportation, we include nice places to walk and linger, we include safe, protected spaces to cycle, we can increase the capacity, sometimes even tenfold, of that old car model. So we really think that the traffic planning model that we should be using in the 21st century is one where you have these direct A to B connections for bikes, for pedestrians, for public transport. And this is contentious to say, but it only works this way, is you have to make driving a pain in the ass. If you don't make driving difficult, then we cannot prioritize the other modes. We can't have our cake and eat it too. And we just know from a purely efficiency standpoint, this is an image of Copenhagen, that there's so much more efficiency in other modes of transportation than single occupant vehicles. Even if we could get people to share cars, at that point, how much space is it still taking up? We know we can fit 51 people on bikes and cargo bikes in this small area here, 65 people in that bus. And look, there's maybe a handful, maybe 20 in the cars, taking up sort of 3 times the amount of space just to the left. So if we're going to try to make our cities more bicycle friendly, we recognize all of the utility in changing the transport paradigm, then we need to understand what the bicycle is and how to plan for it as a designer. So for one, we always say, well, bicycles are not cars. They're treated as vehicles in the North American engineering mindset, but cyclists also aren't pedestrians. They're kind of fast-moving pedestrians. They're somewhere in between. And we can see in this graphic that when we remove the bicycle, people just look like these vulnerable pedestrians. Ultimately, there's the same vulnerability, just a slightly higher speed than pedestrians. So why are we called Copenhagenize, and why should we care about Copenhagen? If we want to learn about the bicycle, if we want to try to normalize it in our design, in our building of cities around the world. So when we look at Copenhagen, this is an image from when I used to work out of our Copenhagen office. This was my morning commute. You know, this is the dream image that people have of Scandinavia, and especially of Copenhagen. This beautiful city where you have these long Nordic sunrises and these people with long blonde hair and long legs. This is even, you know, shown in the bicycle logo of the city of Copenhagen, modeled after the I Love New York, with the bicycle as that symbol of love. But the reality is not this. The reality of Copenhagen is actually this. So instead of I bike Copenhagen, it should be something like I vacuum clean Copenhagen. It should be where the bicycle is seen as a form of utility. It's a tool to get around your city, and it's not something to be lusted over. It's not something to be polished and put on your wall and discussed with your friends at the bar. Instead, it's just something you take to get to the bar, you park it outside, and you go inside and you see your friends. The people in this image are just on their way to work in the morning. They seem grumpy, they seem tired. They're just getting around, but it's on 2 or sometimes 3 wheels. And when we look at the data from the city of Copenhagen, Copenhageners are asked every year or two about why they actually cycle. The reason why they cycle is exactly because of efficiency. They don't do it generally because they're trying to save the environment. 7% of people say they do it because it's green. Most people do it because it's fast, it's easy, and maybe to get some exercise in their daily commute. So at the end of the day, the bicycle has been made as the easy choice for Copenhageners, so they make the green choice rather than trying to push people to make that green choice when it may not be easy. And we can actually see that change over time. So as the city of Copenhagen has developed from, we'll talk about this in a minute, from what used to be a very car-centric city in the 70s to now, we actually see there are more bicycles than cars in the inner circle of Copenhagen. This happened in about 2015, 2016, you can see from the chart here. And this is what it actually looks like. This is morning rush hour. This is the world's busiest bicycle street. This is 48,000 cyclists every single day. Queen Louise's Bridge in the center of Copenhagen, the Lakes region. And this is what your typical commute looks like. Within the city of Copenhagen and folks that are going to work and school, you see 62% of people that commute by bicycle. Another 21% is using public transport. Those numbers have changed now since a new metro ring opened last year, but still somewhere in this range. And this is really inspirational. So how do we get to that moment? How do we get to maybe not a Copenhagen level, but how do we get to a higher bicycle modal share? Well, one way is looking at the extensive network of infrastructure that is developed in Copenhagen, and this has been developed for decades. So you have 375 kilometers of protected cycle tracks, and we'll see what that looks like afterwards. But essentially, that is protected bike lanes on both sides of the road to give people all directional and protected options, so the bicycle is a normal way of getting around. We also have green cycle routes, so routes that would cut through parks and along the harbor, and then almost 60 kilometers of super cycle highways, so things that go actually protected out to the suburbs, and people can cycle for 20 or 30 kilometers to get to their home. And we actually know this is what a typical cycle track looks like. We know it can carry almost 6,000 people per hour. Meanwhile, people sitting in their cars, we cannot really get more than 1,300 cars per hour. Again, if we're lucky to get 2 or 3 people in some cars, that number would go up. But the cycle track is so much more efficient. And as a place that also gets snow, maybe not as much snow as some Canadian cities, but ultimately it still needs to be maintained. The only way that people will continue to cycle through the winter is to maintain that and to be proactive. As you can see, the snow clearing machine, which is actually brushing away the snow as it's falling, is leading ahead of the cyclist so that it's ready to use in the morning for the work commute. And this is all important because it's important to note that Copenhagen wasn't always Copenhagen. So these are images from the 1960s in Copenhagen, where there were cars absolutely everywhere, much like we see in a lot of Canadian cities today. This square on the right, the number of car parking spots there actually equals the number of bike parking spots here, the same square today. And so if we can start to think about how to change our cities and really prioritize active modes of transportation and public transportation and not focus on the car, we can have so much more efficiency while also enjoying our city life and our public life. This is amazing, some of the change that you can see. So again, that street on the right that I mentioned before, the busiest bicycle street in the world, Queen Louise's Bridge, that was it in 1977. So this is not some fictitious place where they couldn't necessarily get there. They took a lot of steps and built protected infrastructure over a span of 40 to 50 years to get to where they are today. And a whole number of other investments having been made over the years. There is a harbor that passes through the center of the city. And so a lot of these connections needed to be made just for bicycles and pedestrians to prioritize them. So the first bicycle pedestrian bridge, Bruggebron, here on the left in 2006, transports almost 24,000 cyclists every day, with the very famous cycle snake, the addition, that red loop-de-loop that you see on the right of the screen, that was added in 2014 to create that extra connection that people wanted. We have the Inner Harbor Bridge that was then built in 2016. Every time a cycling and a pedestrian-only bridge is opened up in Copenhagen, the numbers have been higher than anybody expected. And so it's always well used when it's well built and when it connects the network where it needs to go. And there's so many elements that show us that the bicycle is important on the human landscape. So we have human-centered design, things like angled garbage bins, so that when you're cycling into work in the morning and you may have a coffee in your hand and maybe you didn't bring a reusable mug that day, it happens. Well, at least you can throw it into the bin and it's angled towards you and you're not gonna make a mess and have garbage everywhere. But it's also a nod to the fact that you exist as a transport form. And there's, again, more reason why you would continue to ride your bike, have a little bit of fun in the morning as well. Equally, we have things like micro design, footrests and handrests. So it promotes waiting comfortably at red lights to make sure that we're also creating better behavior among all modes of transportation, but also making sure that people are comfortable. And again, a nod to the fact that you exist as a cyclist, you matter, is the message that the city is sending with this design here. And then we have things like the green wave, which I'm sure many people have heard about before, with the idea of synchronizing the lights for a bicycle appropriate speed and being able to gamify it here with LEDs embedded in the pavement. So you'd have to catch the green light or the green wave or to increase your speed or slow down, vice versa, to be able to coast all the way without any red lights. So this is where I really bring up the question of what if we followed this model and we said, let's be designers of our cities instead of engineering our cities. Let's look at design principles, the Danish design principles, for example, of furniture and lighting, where we're always asking three questions. Is the thing that I'm designing intuitive? Do I know how to use it without, an IKEA-style manual of how to put it together? Two, and yes, I'm sorry if that was a dig at the Swedes. Two, is it encouraging? Does it actually help me do what I need to do in my daily life? And three, is it desirable? It has to be attractive and it has to be something that I want to use in my life. So when we look at some examples, especially here in North America, we have to ask these questions. This is right in the center of Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., a quote unquote protected lane, but is this designed? First of all, is this intuitive? How do I get on this? I need to figure out to get to an intersection and then cross the light at the right time and then awkwardly make a 90-degree turn and not hit somebody coming. It's not intuitive whatsoever. And I wouldn't argue that it's particularly attractive either. Okay, sorry, just got a note here. How about this as a piece of design? This is as we call, plain Jane bike lane here in Montreal. We would put a squishy, vulnerable bicycle user between two giant moving metal boxes, one that has a swinging door and the other one that's moving fast. Is that intuitive? Is that desirable? Would most people want to put themselves in that situation? No. And then you wonder why people ask, oh, well, why would you ever ride your bicycle in the city? Because if this is the main type of infrastructure you're being afforded, it's not welcoming to everyone. And don't even get me started on this, the dreaded Shara. This is not design whatsoever, not intuitive, not clear, not attractive, not encouraging. The goal is we have to realize that transportation itself is inherently social. We build cars that have passenger seats. We have buses where you can sit and talk to people or not, look at your iPhone. But ultimately, transport is social. So when we build bicycle infrastructure that is safe and wide enough so that we can have things like conversations, it allows us to cycle home with our partner, with our friend, with our colleague, with our classmate. And it really enforces that social aspect and makes us want to use the bicycle as a form of transportation. So for us, I'm going to sort of end off on this sort of methodology that we always use in our projects with clients around the world. And this is talking about the context. This is really about if we're going to plan a bicycle-friendly city, what we really need to look at is the context along two different categories. One, the speed, the vehicle speed of that corridor, and two, the capacity, how many cars are moving down that street per day. So when we get into the smaller speed, smaller capacity context, the top left, we have one type of design, which is what we call the shared space. And this is where we don't necessarily need any direct bicycle infrastructure because the speeds and the capacities are low enough that we can have a space that is cycle friendly without having direct protected infrastructure. If I go back to the chart, the top right, we start to get to speeds of, let's say, 40 kilometers an hour, higher daily traffic use. This is where we go to the painted lane. But in the Danish context, the methodology is always that the painted lane is next to the most vulnerable space. So it would be next to the sidewalk on the edge of the curb, not like the Montreal example we had seen before, where it's between two different cars and is essentially in a danger zone in the roadway. To go back to this, we would go to the bottom right corner and look at higher speeds of 50, 60 kilometers an hour and higher capacities. And then I'll get to the final one on the bottom left, which is the highest speeds, highest capacities. This is where we talk about the cycle track. So the protected infrastructure in the Danish context, this is really a raised, essentially second sidewalk, if you will, where there's a curb separating the roadway from the bicycle space and a curb separating the bicycle space from the pedestrian space. And once speeds get much higher and capacities get as high as even highways, this is where we have total protection and total separation. So whether that is, in this example, a fence on the edge of the sideway of the highway, or very often in contexts like this, the supercycle highways to the suburbs, you'll actually see the bicycle track going through the forest quite far away completely from the roadway. And so the goal was to just really give everybody here that small argumentation of every time you hear from someone, yeah, but that's so-and-so, that's this city, that's that city. We just have to remember that there are design principles that we can take from the best cities around the world and say, these can be applied in our context back home. And just because Copenhagen is Copenhagen and Amsterdam is Amsterdam, doesn't mean that there's nothing that we can learn and improve the cycling conditions back home. And that's why, just to do as a final wrap up, every 2 years we do the Copenhagenize Index, which we publish with Wired Magazine. You can check it out for yourself at copenhagenizeindex.eu. And we did our latest version last year. And essentially we rank cities all around the world, over 600,000 inhabitants and over a 2% bicycle modal share. And we basically publish the top 20 most bicycle-friendly cities to try to show that it's always changing. Cities are constantly innovating, and there are new sort of rising stars and newcomers that are popping into the top 20 every 2 years. That it's not just about the Copenhagens and the Amsterdams, but there are really inspirational stories happening all around the world. So you can actually check out the website for yourself. Just to showcase a couple examples from this last year that we found in our research, the city of Oslo has been doing some incredible work in Norway. This is a very cold, very hilly city, a place with a lot of car use and a lot of money. So people have bought a lot of cars in the past, a lot of electric cars actually. But here they've really been trying to push against car dominance in the city. And they have really jumped up in our index over the last 4 years. And they're really doing some amazing things by just removing thousands of parking spaces left, right, and center to make room for protected infrastructure and high quality infrastructure, as you could see in the photo to your left. Another example of a big car-centric metropolis, which was doing some amazing things early on in the decade and then sort of started to slow down, but is really picking up again, is Paris. Paris has been doing some amazing work about not only offering subsidies to locals to buy e-bikes and cargo bikes, but also building protected infrastructure in like really prominent areas like the Champs-Élysées, where you see that change. And from a marketing perspective, it really starts to change the conversation. And then closer to home, Vancouver's been making some amazing strides. I would still, in my own bias, argue that Montreal is the cycling city of Canada, but I would say that Vancouver's doing some impressive things, building a really fantastic protected network in the downtown core and slowly expanding that beyond the core, and really, really impressive case to be looking at. So thank you very much, and I'll hand it back over to the team for some questions.
Thanks so much, Michael. That was super inspiring. We will move on into our question and answer period. So again, we invite anyone participating in this webinar to reach out through that feature at the bottom of your screen. And I will pass things over to Matthew Chapman, who is the National Campaign Manager at Climate Reality and who will be moderating the question period for us.
Thank you, Natalie. And thank you, Michael. Excellent presentation. We have a number of questions that came in the registration form. So let me go start with a few of those. And again, for those listening in live, you can comment in the Q&A feature, or if you are on YouTube, you can also leave a comment in the YouTube channel. So let me see if I can chop the screen sharing here. Fabulous. Okay, great. There we are. Okay. So I still have Natalie up on screen, but that's fine. One of the questions that came in, convincing city council, what are the arguments? Do you find that the economic arguments work? I've seen some work out of Copenhagenize trying to attribute, economic benefits to cycling. What arguments are going to get city council members? What are the first 1-2 punches that we need to?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that there isn't really necessarily one catch-all. Of course, every city council is different, but I definitely think showing that economic argument, especially along commercial corridors. I mean, some of those arguments that were going back and forth for bike lanes on Bloor in Toronto, and the fact that they were able to put together a really, really convincing study about the economic gains for local businesses, I think it really shows great wins. And I think also being able to document actual personal stories of constituents, being able to showcase how and why something like a protected bike lane actually can have an impact in someone's life, and be able to do that communication with city council members, I think is really, really effective, because at the end of the day, they may have certain people shouting dissent in their ears, but if they're also being shown images and stories of their constituents who have benefited from this infrastructure in a pop-up or in some sort of a collaborative fashion, then I think there's a good potential there.
Great. I know I just checked it out, but there's a good analysis of the economic benefits from the Cycling Embassy of Denmark. Mm-hmm. That they do a bicycle account. So if anybody wants to check that out. You mentioned early in your presentation some of the work that Copenhagenize does around the cultural shift that's necessary. And one of the questions that came up on the registration form was how to encourage the general public themselves. Like, what are the aside from building, build it and they will come. Mm-hmm. What other strategies does Copenhagenize employ?
Well, I think the reason I also wanted to showcase that Saskatoon project that we had finished last year at the beginning of the presentation is that was really not an infrastructure-based project. Saskatoon is an interesting situation where they have a very well done all ages and abilities network plan, but they're facing a huge amount of dissent from certain city council members and from certain public voices in the city against bike lanes. And I think the strategy there was, okay, let's get away from talking directly about infrastructure, because for the general public, infrastructure doesn't resonate. I mean, the same way that when we poll people in Copenhagen and ask them, why do you cycle? They're not saying, oh, well, because the bike lane's really beautiful. They don't really care or think about the infrastructure. It's about how does it actually make a difference in my life? So before you actually have the infrastructure in certain cities, or you don't have it in many places, I think the key is to try to create communications and messaging that opens up the image of cycling and the bicycle beyond the stereotypes that we know it in society today. So that was what our strategy really was in the Saskatoon context, was how can we do a communications campaign through social media and through print, where we really showcase a diversity of Saskatoonians on bicycles, doing different functions, going to work, going to school, having fun, winter cycling, doing all of these different things to say that this is all together the totality of what cycling could be. And we're not just saying it's mammals, the term middle-aged men in Lycra, or weekend riders that are going to be on their bikes, or hipsters that are making noise at night in a quiet neighborhood. I mean, there's all of these negative stereotypes that if we can try to fight some of those and open up the diversity and the potential of what people could be, especially showing cargo bike images is really powerful, because in North America, we don't know much about the cargo bike. It's not very prevalent in our societies. And the more we can see these contraptions, which we call the SUVs of the bicycle kingdom, the more people can go, oh, I could actually transport my kids in a three-wheeler, or I could pick up my groceries, or I could do deliveries. I mean, it opens up the possibilities of what the bike could be used for beyond that narrow subset that people actually think of.
Terrific. Yeah, thanks for that. And that weaves into a good another question that came up with, but what about inclusive cycling? So when it comes time to reach communities that are maybe from other countries where cycling is seen as a, something definitely for the less, wealthy. I live in a neighborhood where like a lot of people might not be interested in cycling because it's seen as a bit of a taboo. How do you open that up? Training people from some cultures, women cycle less frequently. What are some other public education opportunities, or culturally, like aside from showing images, are there trainings these have undertaken? Or
yeah, I mean, to be completely honest, I don't want to pretend to be an expert on inclusive cycling by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I think Matt, we live in the same neighborhood, and I think I've seen some really interesting projects pop up. In Jarry Park here in Montreal, for example, being able to help recent immigrants to Canada get on a bicycle and maybe start to spread the joy of cycling, a little bit in the summer to other family members, and be able to sort of move from a neighborhood perspective, rather than, I don't think a top-down, my own personal opinions, I don't think a top-down image showcase, like you said, would have benefit there. I really think it's more building that capacity in communities, but there also has to be adequate funding for programs like this, so that there can be bikes that are supplied for people to try things out. Another really interesting program that we had heard about and actually tried it ourselves at the city of Copenhagen, where a lot of newcomers were also trying this out, was the city of Copenhagen's cargo bike library. So again, because the cargo bike is very different for a lot of people and they never thought about it in their own lives, the idea was the city was going to buy a whole bunch of different cargo bikes and then let folks come down to the city and basically rent them out like a book. And so they could try it in their own lives for a day or two and see if there was utility and if they liked it, and try to understand how to use the contraption. And from there, maybe actually consider bringing that into their lives. Plus subsidies. I think the cities that are offering subsidies to cargo bikes are very, very beneficial to getting different types of people on bicycles that can be positive in their lives.
Terrific. Thanks so much for that. Last question before we move out to the conclusion. Helmet efficacy. There was a question around that. So how do you communicate the pros, the cons? And the question was pretty broadly framed, implying that helmets are, absolutely necessary or not. But do you want to speak to that?
Well, I would preface it by saying I'm the wrong person to ask, because our company has been known to have a very specific stance on the helmet debate. We are not anti-helmet. We are anti-forcing people to wear helmets. We think it comes down to a personal decision. Ultimately, we end up looking at the larger examples from around the world of cities that have slapped on mandatory helmet laws, looking at Australia, looking at Washington State, looking at BC for one example, though Vancouver is a bit of an anomaly with, from what I've heard, police not really enforcing it. we don't see positive outcomes in places where people are forced to wear a helmet. Our goal is to lower the barriers to entry to cycling, and for better or for worse, wearing a helmet for some people is a barrier to entry. Some people just don't want to wear a helmet, and some people choose not to cycle for that reason. I think it's a larger conversation to get in, so I'll sort of leave it on some lighter points. But I think ultimately it comes down to personal choice. We know that the largest indicators of safety in cycling are more people cycling and safe infrastructure. So I think from a systemic perspective, the goal is to not get into a situation where we are victim blaming and saying you are less safe because you did not take this into your own hands, but rather we're saying if the design of the roadway is promoting cars to drive at 60 kilometers an hour and you're given a sharrow, then shame on the government. And that's not necessarily something that you should be taking on yourself.
Terrific. Thank you so much for the time you've been so generous with. I'm going to let Sophia, Climate Realities Communications Coordinator, take us out and share with us a couple of calls to action, taking this information into our communities. So
Cheers.
please,
thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Michael, for joining us.
Hi, everyone. First off, I want to say thanks to everyone who attended this first webinar of our Brunch and Learn series. I hope you enjoyed it. I invite you to watch the Stat Tracker and DataWiz webinars and use the knowledge to leverage cycling data in the Stat Tracker to raise ambition in your city. You can find these webinars on climatehub.ca. I also invite you to download the 2019 standings of the National Climate League, or join a climate hub if you're interested in getting involved in decarbonization efforts at the city level. You can also find all of this at climatehub.ca. You can also follow us on social media if you haven't already. Our Facebook is Climate Reality Canada or Réalité Climatique Canada, and Twitter is at reality_Canada. If you'd like, we also have a newsletter that goes out on a quarterly basis, and you can sign up to this through our website, which is climatereality.ca or realitéclimatique.ca. Finally, if you're interested in attending one of Climate Reality's trainings, we strongly urge you to apply to this week. Today is actually the last day you can apply for the San Antonio training, which is taking place from April 14th to 16th. But there are 5 trainings happening throughout 2020. So if you're interested in that, we invite you to go to Climate Reality's website, which is climaterealityproject.org. Thank you, everyone.